As anyone with even a passing interest in politics will know, last week a general election was held in the UK. We here at TLDR News stayed up until 3 AM attempting to follow the results as they came in. But as it turned out, we mainly ended up playing some vaguely politics-related games all night. So, as it's been a few days and we've had a chance to really see the impact of the election, in this video we will briefly explain what happened throughout Thursday night and what it means for the UK and EU going forward. Before we do though, just a heads up about our merch store. If you live in Western Europe, you still have time to order badges to be delivered before Christmas, but you'll have to be quick. For many locations the deadline is today at 1 PM or tomorrow at 10 PM. So, if you want to pick up any of our badges as Christmas gifts for a friend or even yourself, head to the store now. Prior to election night, the polls were predicting a Conservative win. Despite Labour climbing in the polls, so were the Conservatives. The result of this was a 10-point Conservative lead in the polls on the day before the election. It was pretty clear looking at the data that across the week both of the major parties were eating up votes from the smaller parties, mainly the Liberal Democrats and Brexit Party, with their vote share in the polls dropping day by day leading up to the election. Despite this, an MRP poll from YouGov a few days prior to the election left the possibility of a hung parliament on the table, with the Conservatives as the largest party. A hung parliament is when no party wins enough seats to form a majority government. What this means in practice is that it's difficult for the largest party to govern and pass laws, as they then must rely on other parties in nearly every vote. If the Conservatives found themselves in the position of presiding over a hung parliament, then they had three options: form a minority government, rely on a confidence and supply arrangement, and form a coalition. The Conservatives seemed to think that this was something that the public didn't want and repeatedly mentioned the possibility of a hung parliament in campaign material in the days leading up to the vote. Regardless of whether the strategy actually worked, this isn't what happened, so we won't discuss hung parliaments in any further detail today, but let us know in the comments if you want us to discuss these in more detail in another video. Luckily for the Conservatives, a hung parliament didn't happen. Instead, they won an 80-seat majority. In effect, this means that it's very easy for them to pass legislation. They could have 79 of their own MPs rebel against the government and still easily pass bills. This wasn't even just a fluke of the first past the post voting system. Johnson won a phenomenal portion of the vote. Back in 1997, there was a huge swing to the Labour Party and Tony Blair following the John Major government. It was a landslide election and a turning point in British political history that delivered the Labour government a 179-seat majority. They did this with only 43.2% of the votes. Last week, Johnson won a higher portion of the vote than Blair did, at 43.6% of the votes. In fact, the last time a Conservative leader won a higher portion of the vote than this was back in 1979 when Margaret Thatcher was first elected, and she received only 0.3% a higher vote share than Johnson did. Clearly, this election was a resounding success for both Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. What's even more impressive for the Conservatives is that they managed to do this by overturning historically strong Labour seats. You might remember that we put out a video at the end of last week explaining the core battlegrounds that the Conservatives had to win. One of those battles was in the historically Labour-held North and Midlands. This was a battle that the Conservatives were able to pretty much dominate. Some pretty famous historic Labour MPs were beaten for the first time in decades. The best example of this was the infamous Beast of Bolsover, Dennis Skinner. Dennis Skinner had been in his Bolsover seat since 1970 and has won every election there since. He has become somewhat of an icon in the Labour Party for being outspoken, this being exemplified best by his outburst at David Cameron, calling him Dodgy Dave and promptly being kicked out of the chamber. After 49 years of service in the Bolsover constituency, he was ousted last week. This kind of thing happened across England, where Labour lost 47 seats, with the English losses making up the majority of the 59 they lost across the UK. Political commentators were quick to pick up on this as the results were being announced. In fact, the third seat to be announced showed which way the tide was going, with Blythe Valley changing to the Conservative Party for the first time in 84 years. So, the Conservatives must be pretty chuffed right now. But they're not the only ones. The Scottish National Party, or SNP, won 48 of the 59 seats in Scotland. This is 13 more than they won back in 2017. It has often been assumed that the key to winning a general election is through Scotland. To win, you have to win Scotland. In 2017, the Conservatives won 13 seats in Scotland, up from the 1 they won in 2015. This was reduced to under half that in last week's election. Now they only have 6. The SNP were able to take back seats in Scotland, undermining the idea that the route to number 10 lies through Scotland. So, it turns out that the SNP's success has not necessarily undermined the Conservatives in the way that it was assumed it would. It has, however, impacted the Liberal Democrats. The SNP took the seat of Jo Swinson, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, by only around 700 votes. Despite the success of the SNP and Conservatives, it is known that general elections are a zero-sum game, and their success must have come from somewhere. Unfortunately for Labour and the Liberal Democrats, they were the parties who paid the price. Labour had its worst election in post-World War II history. They performed even worse than in 1983, when the Labour Party was led by Michael Foot and lost so many seats that their manifesto became known as the longest suicide note in history. Last week, Labour performed even worse. The Washington Post has already published an article comparing the two elections. The problem for Labour now is selecting a new leader. Following Michael Foot's loss, the Labour Party spent over a decade modernising. They ditched the policies in their 1983 manifesto and attempted to bring the party to the centre ground. This led to the eventual election of Tony Blair in 1997. Do the Labour Party attempt to do the same now? Or have times changed and do they need a leader with similar views to Corbyn? These are the tough questions Labour need to answer before the next election. The Liberal Democrats also had a pretty rough night. Despite their promising polling early on, they won 11 seats overall, down from 12 in the 2017 general election. They also lost their leader, Jo Swinson. Their policy of revoking Article 50 and remaining in the EU did not work out for them in the way that they'd hoped. On the other side of the Brexit divide, the Brexit Party also had a pretty bad night. They failed to win a single seat. This wasn't too surprising, however, as the first-past-the-post voting system discriminates against smaller parties, and Farage had already stepped aside some of his candidates in constituencies that had a hardline Conservative Brexiteer standing. That's what happened in the election. The people voted and selected 365 Conservative MPs who will form a new government. With the Conservatives winning such a resounding portion of the seats in the Commons, the Brexit process is now pretty much left entirely in their hands. The problem that former Prime Minister Theresa May had back in the spring was that she wasn't able to get a majority of MPs to support her deal. Johnson had pretty much the same issue back in autumn, with him also failing to get his deal through Parliament. Johnson blamed this on MPs obstructing his deal, but essentially the parliamentary deadlock had been a result of the Conservatives not having a majority. Those issues look like they're the thing of the past with the new parliamentary makeup. Johnson still wants the UK to leave the EU by the end of January, under the terms set out in his deal. To do this, he will still need to get his deal passed through the Commons, and it looks like he's set to do this. With the Conservatives' huge majority, around 80 Conservative MPs would need to rebel to block the bill's passage. While some MPs could go against the government, Johnson has always insisted all new Conservative MPs back his deal. And even if they don't, the size of his majority means that Johnson shouldn't struggle to pass his withdrawal agreement by his planned exit date of the 31st of January. Once this has happened, the UK will have officially left the EU, meaning that in just 46 days' time, the UK could have left the European Union. Once this has happened, Johnson can proceed to negotiate trade talks with the EU. Johnson claims that he wants to get this done by the end of 2020, but there's some serious doubt that he'll be able to get this done in the time frame that he's stipulated. If he doesn't manage it by the end of 2020, then the UK will leave the EU without a trade deal, which would effectively be the no-deal exit that many wanted to avoid. If Johnson doubts that he can get a deal done before the end of 2020, the UK and EU can negotiate an extension to the transition period. The withdrawal agreement states that the UK and EU can agree to extend the transition by 1 or 2 years, as long as the extension is agreed to by July. This means that despite the majority the Conservatives have, the future of Brexit is still somewhat unclear. The UK looks like it will definitely be out of the EU before the end of January, but when the transition will end is less clear. Johnson has insisted he won't request an extension to the transition, but based on his dead in a ditch comments earlier in the year, that's not 100% guaranteed. We won't speculate on this any further, but if you do want to keep up to date as it plays out, be sure to subscribe to the channel. You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified with all of our future videos. And you can also search for us on social media with just TLDR News. And lastly, if you want your name to be featured at the end of this video, like these people, you can back us on Patreon. Jack has way too many things he says at the end of the videos.